I'm Rudolph. Welcome to the Tardigrade Chronicles. In this episode, we're going to start to look at sensing and how sensing has been captured in engineering designs from our understanding of evolutionary principles. And in this episode, we'll start with olfaction, or smelling, chemical sensing, because there's been real interest over time to capture sensing in systems, whether it's a diagnostic system that's measuring something for a human medical condition, or it's environmental sensing looking for pollutants or smoke in the atmosphere. The ability to sense our environment is a critical aspect of evolution, because the first recognition of self or a mate or a food target in our evolutionary designs came from chemical sensing. Vision came later, and we'll talk about the explosion of evolution as a result of the evolution of the eye. But in this episode, we're going to focus on the nose, or the chemical sensing. We'll separate that somewhat from gustatory sensing or taste, but it's a similar process because our taste also involves the recognition of chemical elements through receptors in the biological system. But there's been such a strong interest in understanding olfaction from the earliest invertebrates or earliest forms of life all the way up to the mammals. And of course, in engineering, you might see the dog nose as being the most interesting element or design to understand. We've seen many programs invested by a number of agencies in electronic noses, as they call them. Some attempt to capture the sensing modalities, sensitivity, specificity of what evolution has designed. And again, critical. If you can't find a food target, you can't find a mate, you don't exist. And so the evolutionary pressures associated with specificity and sensitivity were really important to sustaining life. But what's really interesting about biological sensing in the chemical world of olfaction is the ability of biological systems to recognize those targets in noisy environments, in mixtures, which is not really easy to do and hard to design in engineering. And anybody who's built sensors or diagnostics will tell you that the sample preparation or the sampling of the environment, whether it's an air sample or water sample, is a critical design feature. You got to do something to the sample to put it in the right condition for the system to detect. Whereas the biological system evolved over millions of years and has figured out how to capture that sensitivity and specificity in a very noisy, mixtured world. And so we're going to look at that. You may have heard words like pheromones. That's a very well-known topic of describing sets of chemicals that are associated with hormones or sexual targets. Certainly anybody who's walked into a kitchen where lasagna is being made understands how the smell could lead to food and oftentimes results in behaviors when you smell things that are food targets that prepare you to eat. So behavior associated with these very interesting and elegant sensing modalities are an important feature of the evolutionary pressures. What do you do with what you've sensed, and how do you react or how do you behave? And as I said, there are, we mentioned the dog's nose. Well, in evolutionary designs, there are a number of organs, like the nose, that have been designed. One that of particular interest, if you look into how we've studied the evolutionary designs and put them into engineering principles, is in insects. And probably the invertebrate insect world or some of the crustaceans have the broadest set of diverse evolutionary designs. I think there are more species of beetles on the planet than any other species. And if you look at the various ways insects and others have evolved sensory modalities, they've offered the engineering world rich bounty of things to derive new systems from. And we'll look at some of those. I mentioned insects and insect antennae. So you've probably heard the word antennae, but in the invertebrate world, the antenna is a very strong sensing organ that has a lobe at the bottom called the antennal lobe that is essentially a neuronal processing lobe for what is the antenna sensing, how do I process that, and what do I tell the insect to do with that? Is that a mate? Is that a fire I need to either fly from or towards? Because we'll talk about that. Some insects are evolved to actually fly towards wildfires, and we'll talk about why. But the antennal lobe is really the organ that results in the computational processing of the olfactory system in an insect. And there are certain insects or species like moths that have become the model species. One is the Manduca sexta, the moth that is a very large moth. And in fact, I have an example of a Manduca here. This is an example of two moths, Manduca sexta. They're quite large. They can fly quite a distance. They're very strong flyers, and they've been studied considerably for their sensing modalities associated with mating. And so these are an example of organisms that have provided a lot of information about how systems, especially invertebrate systems with antennae, also sample and sense. You also know lobsters have large antennae off the front. They use those in aqueous environments to sense, and you may have seen lobsters with large antennae, antennal lobes, both in the water and in tanks, maybe on your plate, that have these antennae that are used for similar detection. There are other systems that, like the jewel beetle, that has an interesting sensing organ, as I mentioned, that in this case measures infrared signals, not just chemical signals. So the diversity of evolution has brought forward not just chemical sensing, but other modalities of sensing. And the jewel beetle is called the jewel beetle because it actually wants to lay its eggs in the burnt bark of a forest fire after the fire's out. So evolution has designed some of these sensors, again, associated with their reproduction cycles, and they're very exquisitely tuned to sensing modalities that are associated with the sustainment of life, in this case, reproduction. The other interesting aspect of insect antennae, it turns out in some systems you can actually train the animals to detect certain compounds. And many of you have heard of Pavlovian training with positive reward. So if you feed Manduca moths with a sugar water laced with a certain target of interest, it becomes susceptible, or now is starting to look for that target associated with the detection in its antenna. And in particular example that I'm familiar with is, again, when I was employed by the Defense Department, there was a lot of interest to find landmines. Very difficult problem. The only real technology for many years the Defense Department had, or any civilian department looking for landmines, was to fly over a road and see over time, was there something that changed? Is there now evidence that somebody buried something? But this was the chemical detection of TNT or DNT. And so it was easy using Pavlovian training, and it's been done in the field, many papers with other targets, but in one particular application I'm familiar with, you could actually train these insects to look for targets of interest like explosive chemicals. The insects could be trained, and then the antennae were also now trained to look for those targets. And so you actually train the neuronal system, the antennae and antennal lobe, to be sensing something of interest in addition to its pheromones for reproductive targets, in addition to other food targets. And of course, by putting a target into a food source, you're introducing a target of interest in the behavioral evolutionary design of finding food targets. There's another really interesting application that took place and is still going on, where they're trying to train these systems, in this case, not just an insect, but dogs. You may have seen and heard that some dogs can detect and smell cancers. And that's a really interesting aspect. Of course, we know dogs' sensing is profound. We've seen dogs, of course, used in inspections. They've been trained to look for targets, a variety of sources. Some of that is, of course, visual, but most of it is through smell. And that's a very similar training where you're training a living system and its olfactory system for targets of interest. And that actually, again, through the insect example, is conserved through time. And that's probably the dynamics in adaptation, where if you're in an environment that has a changed food source, you have to be able to adapt your neuronal system, your antenna, to pick up new sources. And so that's why dogs' olfactory systems can be trained, insect systems can be trained. And then there was a very interesting and still ongoing application where you're actually using the social structure of a biological system. That is, many of the species together are looking for targets. And this greatest example is with the honeybee. So the honeybee, of course, exists in colonies, and honeybees essentially any hive is 5 to 10,000 bees. But if you think about it, there are 5 to 10,000 bees that are looking for targets over a 5 to 10 kilometer range. So it's essentially like having 5 to 10,000 flying dogs flying over 5 to 10 kilometers that are looking for targets. Now, of course, the honeybees are looking for flowers, nectars, and colors and shape. But it turns out that you can train honeybees much like you can train dogs, much like you can train other insects, and you can train whole hives. This was really brought forward by a really amazing investigator at the University of Montana named Jerry Bromenshank. And over the last few decades, Jerry has shown what we are now putting into practice, that you can train honeybees to targets and use them in a variety of ways. Now, again, I happen to be in a position where the Defense Department was interested in looking for targets of interest, olfactory targets of interest, like landmines, and we trained whole hives to become attracted to explosive targets. That was a very interesting example, and it kind of showed that you can really use a biological system and train it to be sensitive and specific to targets of interest. Now, how it was used was also really interesting, because once the honeybees were trained, they could be trained in almost a day or two. With, again, lacing their sugar water with some compounds of interest like TNT, DNT. The honeybees would now be placed at various locations, and now the challenge is, well, could you track the honeybees? That's a challenge, because if they're transiting 5 to 10,000 agents traveling over 5-10 kilometers is a challenge. Again, a sensor challenge. How do you follow all those bees as to where they go? And so we actually took a different tact, where we put 2 hives on the side of a truck checkpoint, and the truck would drive up, and the bees, if the truck contained a target of interest, the bees would light on the truck. So the bees would be maybe 5 to 10 yards off of the checkpoint. The truck would pull up to the checkpoint. if it contained an explosive, you had a camera on the back of the checkpoint. You asked the truck to stay there for 5 minutes. If you counted a significant number of bees on the back of the truck, pull the truck over and see if it contained explosives. So that was a really interesting example of engineering a system from a biological system like the honeybee hive. It turns out that the bees collect a lot of things naturally on their body as well, and we exploited that in addition because essentially a bee is like an electrostatic dust mop. It flies around and collects all kinds of particles and spores on its body. Chemicals will dissolve in its waxy cuticle of its skin. It comes back to the hive. The hive is a higher temperature because of the brood. And these volatiles, you can measure the air in a hive for a lot of things of interest that the bees might be coming back. And of course, honeybees are used as part of EPA Superfund test site. If you're wanting to know if, for example, there's pollutants in a large area, honeybees are used in this way. Not trained honeybees for pollutants, but more just for the passive collection of what they bring back. And, another aspect of this kind of detection is sampling. I mentioned this, and anybody who's owned a dog, that, yes, they may have an elegant olfactory system, but they do a lot of sniffing. And the sniffing and the nose structure, the evolution of the nose structure has been, again, really tuned to both the olfactory attributes of the chemical detection, but now you have a sampling system. And that sniffing is done in a very careful way that exacerbates or amplifies the olfactory detection. Similarly with an antenna. And if you've seen a lobster in a tank, you'll see lobsters flicking their antenna. That's essentially a sampling method. And again, anybody in the sensing or diagnostics worlds understands that sample collection and sample processing are as important as the elements of detection used for sensitivity and specificity. So the evolutionary designs have appreciated that, not only designed both the sensing modalities of chemical detection, but the sampling modalities of how a biological system samples. And of course, as systems got more mature or more complex, like the dog, it actually turns out that the olfactory detection of a dog is not just the dog, but the dog and its handler. And this is a really sort of new chapter in understanding, for example, how do dogs and their trainers actively succeed. And some of the competitions, they actually have dog and trainer competitions to see who can find targets soonest in more complex environments. And that's a behavioral dance between the human and the dog, because they've essentially co-evolved. And we'll talk about that in another episode about co-evolution of man and animal. Man and dog, man and horse are probably the most telling examples of co-evolution of humans and animals. But especially in this olfactory world, the ability of a dog to detect targets is really also dependent on the handler and the co-evolution of behavior between the handler and the dog. This was most recently elucidated actually through brain measurements, EEG, of a dog and its handler. Not surprisingly, there's cooperativity that could be measured in neuronal signals of what the dog is looking for from the human, what the human is telling the dog with regard to where to look, not necessarily how to sniff or the sensitivity and specificity, but just pointing out that the behavior of detection in the dog in some applications, like finding targets of landmines, explosives, contraband, is really the cooperation and co-evolution of behaviors between the dog and the human. So this world is really magic, because there's so many sensory modalities of that evolution has given us, and we've really only tapped some to quite some success. But we still have challenges in mixtures. We have challenges in blends and challenges in noisy environments. And those are hard to emulate in engineering designs. We call them false positives and false negatives in the actual implementation of a system, but they're really hard to emulate. And so what some people have done, and it's kind of an interesting offshoot of this world, is actually combine the living system with artificial system. So we describe those antennal lobes, and there have been numerous papers and applications where they've actually removed the antennal lobe from an insect that's been trained to a target and put it on a robot or put it on an engineered system that will actually transduce the signal from the antenna, allowing the biological system to detect with sensitivity and specificity to capture its ability to detect in mixtures and blends and noisy environments and transduce that signal into an engineered system. So that's called hybrid systems, where you actually have a biological hybrid system that's a complex evolutionary design, and you've essentially attached it to an engineered system, a microelectronic, or some way to transduce that signal. Of course, there are many diagnostics and sensors that use molecular biomolecules, antibodies, all kinds of aptamers. There are all kinds of biomolecules, but those don't capture the kind of detection of mixtures, blends, noisy environments, the sampling, the flicking. That's something that these hybrid systems captured, because we really can't do that well at the molecular scale yet. We have to capture evolution at the tissue or organ scale. Now, we haven't taken a dog's nose and stuck it on an engineered system. There have been attempts to recreate the materials and structure of a dog nose because it has interesting tuberculi or channels. There's been mimetic examples of trying to recreate what biology has done. But there are these hybrid systems that they've actually taken the antenna off of a biological system or an organ off of a simple invertebrate, attached it to a machine, and used it as a sensing element, much in the way that we've described. So we've gone through a number of examples. One of those I want to final is, I mentioned the antenna, but one of the more interesting examples is called proboscis extension response. Proboscis is a fancy word for nose, but essentially insects, honeybees, when they actually land on a flower, they'll stick out their proboscis and sample the nectar. So there's a behavioral response. There have been systems that have been built that actually capture the proboscis extension response. In other words, they're measuring the behavioral response as a detection of that olfaction. One of the more interesting ones was a British company that actually built a system where you load 6 honeybees in, you bring the vapor or aerosol of interest that you want to sample, that you think it has a target, you put it into this box where the honeybees are. You have a digital laser system across where the bees sit, so that when they stick out their nose, they break the laser signal. And so they statistically, with 6 bees in there, if a target of interest came into the box, 6 bees would stick out their nose and proboscis extension response and give you a statistical response. So again, honeybees that were trained, this proboscis extension response for the last decade or so has been a real interesting behavioral response that's been used in engineering designs, been used in some environmental sampling as a way to capture some of the evolutionary behaviors associated with animal detection. We didn't talk about gustatory. That's an interesting chemical taste, and we'll talk about that in another episode. But it was really my intention to really show you some of the elegant evolutionary principles that have been captured in engineering designs. And I'm Alan Rudolph. Thanks for watching.